to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some ideas in pawn endgames. Let's get started. Here we go. As we know, in pawn endgames, perhaps the most important things are the passed pawns, because we're trying to promote them, make them a queen, and as such win the game. So let's see this example that we have in front of us, where white has the only pawn on the board and white is trying to promote it. The problem at the moment is that the white king is standing right in front of it, and therefore the pawn cannot advance freely. Let's see what happens if white plays the natural king b4, and let's say the black king is trying to come towards the promotion square, king f5. If right now white proceeds by advancing the pawn and black keeps getting closer to that promotion square, we'll realize that the king is right on time. And when the pawn promotes, black will be able to capture it. Therefore, black is saving the game. White needs to be more careful than that. White, at the same time that needs to advance the pawn, in fact, before that, white needs to make sure the black king does not reach b7 or b8 in time to stop the white pawn from promoting. The way to accomplish that is to make sure the white king gets there first, namely to b7. So, the correct move for white is to move king b5, king e6, king b6, king d7. And now, if the black king would arrive to c8, the game would be a draw. So white still has to postpone advancing the a-pawn and play king to b7. As we can see, now the white king keeps the black king away from those three squares on the c file, which would bring the black king closer to catching the promotion square. And black now is helpless against the white pawn, simply marching up the a file. Let's move on and see a different type of situation. Here we go. In this position, again, white has an extra pawn, but black has a pawn still as well. In this example, we'll see the method of how two pawns, isolated pawns that are not connected, can still protect each other indirectly. In the position we see on the board, we see that the black king is about to capture our pawn on d3. Not hard to get convinced that the white king is too far away to protect either of those pawns. So what can white do? Well, what white can and should do is to advance the b pawn. Remember this pawn formation when two pawns are trying to defend each other. What happens in such situations is that the black king cannot capture the white pawn on d3 because then the other pawn marches up along the b file and will be always one tempo ahead of the black king, which would be trying to run back, catch it. In the meantime, on the other side of the board, the white king is conveniently already positioned on the promotion square, so there's nowhere to go with the black h pawn. But what happens if black decides to play king d5 with the idea to then go to c6 and go around and capture the pawn in such a way? Well then, king h2, king c6. And now it would be a mistake indeed to keep moving up with the king going after the pawn, because then the black king gets around and can capture the pawn on b4. However, what white needs to do is, after king c6, to play d4. And now, whichever side or whichever pawn the black king goes to, for example, after king b5, we push the other pawn. And now, symmetrically, we have the similar idea with the other pawn like we had earlier back on the 3rd and 4th rank, now on the 4th and 5th rank, that again the black king cannot safely capture the pawn on b4 because then the d pawn runs away and cannot be caught. And this keeps going on and on if the black king goes back around, giving white the time to move the king up, go after the black pawn on h6. Of course, needing to be a bit careful. When the king moves to c7, we need to push the pawn again. And now again, depending on which side the king appears, we push the pawn on the other side with b6, and again, indirectly the two pawns protect each other. The king is unable to go to c7 or c6. If king takes pawn on d5, the b pawn runs away, and again, after king d7, king h4, king c8, when the king moves onto the file in between the two pawns, that's when we advance the pawn further. And then the king moves either way, pawn advances, and now actually the pawn becomes unstoppable. Let's move on to yet another theme that's so typical for pawn endgames. Here we go. In this position, we see even number of pawns, but white has an outside passed pawns. The reason why that element is important is because it's likely that white will hold off or in fact go after black's f pawn by advancing his own h pawn. Black will be busy guarding or even capturing white's side pawn, white's rook pawn. So in the meantime that white goes and grabs the f7 pawn, black will go and get the h2 pawn. What happens after all of that happens, the white king will be on the f file, while the black king will be on the h file. Pretty much regardless where exactly on those files. But the white king will be 2 files closer to the pawns on the other side of the board, and that will give white the winning advantage. Let's see a sample variation how white can win this game. Typically for pawn endgames, it's extremely important to get our king activated as soon as possible and use the king as an attacking piece going after the enemy pawns. So here white starts by playing king to f3. Black plays king f6, king f4. Now the black king needs to choose go left or right, and then it's time to advance the pawn. We're using that pawn as a decoy to make sure the black king is busy with it. Black is going for it, going after the pawn, and now white needs to play actively and go after black's f7 pawn. White advances and king f7. Even though black here got relatively close, it's still too late. King e7, king e5, king d7, king d5. Black at the moment protected the pawn, but the problem is that black becomes in Zugzwang, which means if black could just keep passing and not making any changes to the position, the game would be a draw. But as we know, in chess that's not allowed. Black must move either his king in which case the pawn would be lost. For example, after king c4, king takes, that extra tempo that white has, that white is the first one capturing the pawn, protecting the b4 pawn at the same time, gives white the winning advantage. Going back to this key position where black got into Zugzwang, right here, black can on the other hand try to play c5. What happens after c5? Well, if white would trade the pawns immediately, the game would be a draw. But white can do better. White can play king b6, immediately going after the pawn on b5, and at the same time also attacking the pawn on c5. If now comes king c4, protecting the b5 pawn, white would simply capture, and then the c pawn would run away and arrive with a check and reach an easily winning endgame. But what happens after pawn takes? Pawn takes back and then king c4. Now black does not lose the pawn on c5. True, they do not lose the pawn on c5, but they do lose the game after white plays king a5, putting black in a Zugzwang. And the pawn cannot move, and anywhere the king moves, the black pawn is gone. It's history. A very important and typical example for pawn endgames. Beware of allowing your opponent having an outside passed pawn, because this is exactly what may happen. Let's move on and discuss a different situation again. Here we go. In this case, each side has one pawn and both of them are about to be promoted. So really, the question will be a queen versus queen endgame, which is of course a very typical scenario that a pawn endgame transposes to a queen endgame, after each side promotes a pawn. Naturally, white would want to promote the pawn to a queen, the most valuable piece. And so would black. So let's look at this position. Normally speaking, if the pieces would be kind of positioned more randomly, the game would always be a draw, unless there is an immediate way to either checkmate or make a skewer or capture the opponent's queen. But here it's not obvious how either of those could be accomplished. And yet this is a position where white to move can win. The reason for that is because the white king is very close to the black king, and at the same time the black king is almost in the corner. You'll see the different technical opportunities that white has at his disposal. Of course, white has to make some very forceful moves to start with. First, check on h2. Now the black king can go to a number of squares, but really only one of them causes any kind of challenge for white. If the black king would go to d1, of course, black would lose immediately after a skewer with queen g1 or h1, and then capturing the black queen in the corner. How about if the black king moves next to the queen in the corner on b1? Remember this idea, it's very important. Then white would have the time to make a very quiet and peaceful move, playing king b3. Incredibly, but because both the black queen and king are cornered, black has no way to prevent the checkmate threat on the back rank of the white queen. Let's go back again and look at the most challenging move, which is moving the king to c1. The advantage of this move is that while the king is still on the first rank, it's close enough to the queen, so after a skewering check, the king can move to a square where it protects the queen, and also it gives an escape for the black queen. For example, after king b3, black could start giving checks with his queen and tie the game. Let's go back and see how white should continue. White needs to at first zigzag and get his queen closer to the action. First move queen g1, just like he would give a skewer, making sure the black king can only move to b2 from where it protects the queen. And now queen f2. And now we're involving a different idea as well. If now the king moves to a3, then the white queen will play queen e3. Now the new idea is that if now king a2, then queen b3 all of a sudden ends the game. Of course, moving up to a4 would result in a checkmate with queen a7. But what about if the king moves back to b2? Well, then white achieved the goal, getting the queen real close to the action. And here black has to choose from two unpleasant choices. One being moving the king to b1, when we already know the method to win, simply the quiet move king b3. And just as when the white queen was on h2, here also black is helpless against the threatening checkmates on the first rank. But what happens if after the check on d2, instead the black king appears on a3? Well, then we again can force into the checkmate position the black king in just two moves. So try to figure out what that solution is. And it's the check with queen b4, and voila, a beautiful checkmate. Let's go and see the next example, which is a very simple pawn endgame, but yet it has some tricks in it. White has a passed pawn, but if the black king would reach some square in front of the pawn in a reasonable future, the game will be a draw. For example, after king f2, king e7, king f3, black would save the game by moving to f7, maintaining the so-called distant opposition. What that means is that after king f4, black would keep opposition, king g4, king g6, and as we learned in one of the previous lessons, the game would end in a draw. Let me just show a sample variation. Even though the pawn can advance, because the king is in front of it, the game cannot be won in such a manner as we know, because now the king moves to the middle to meet the white king on either side, and then the game ends with stalemate. So let's go back all the way to the beginning and think again. What can we do? How can white win this game? What we need to remember is that we need to reach a position when, let's say, if we make these moves, king f6 would be a blunder because of king f4. So, in other words, we need to reach this position with black to move. That means that black needs to give up the opposition, because after king g6, king g4, the king needs to decide which side to go on, and the white king will go the other way. And as you'll see in a minute, black keeps losing the opposition, and eventually white will be ready to advance the pawn, and then the pawn becomes unstoppable. Let's go back again. The problem we saw after king f2, king e7, king f3, king f7, that white has no way to achieve that, because every time the white king would move to the fourth rank, the black king would move to the 6th rank, exactly opposite the white king on a same color square. This is a theoretical draw. While white can try to win, with correct defense on the black side, it's impossible. And yet, white has a way to win this game. I suggest you try to think and figure out what is the winning way in this position for white. The trick here is the king needs to go from the side. Play king g2, after king e7, play king h3, king f6, and king h4. And as we can see, now the king is already on the side, and after king g6, king g4, we're back to the same situation that we just saw a minute ago. So remember, while usually the straight way is the best, there are times on the chessboard when going the side way is even better. And let's see our final example for this lesson. In this example, we'll see the idea when we want to force the opponent's king onto a certain square or diagonal. We have passed pawns, so they typically need to be pushed. Pawn advances on both sides. If each side would now keep advancing the pawn one by one, we'll notice that white arrives first, but black arrives right after that, and the white king being too far from the black, there is no special angle that would make an exception from the rule that queen versus queen is a draw. But here, white can be tricky, and white can try to catch the black pawn by playing king d5. The black king cannot do the same because it's 2 squares behind the rank where the white pawn is at. So if black would try to play king f3, the white pawn would be always a tempo ahead. If now black would push the pawn, white could get next to the pawn and simply win. But what happens if now black plays king d3? If king c5, then all of a sudden the king is catching the white pawn. And if pawn advances, then both pawns promote one after another. That's true, but we achieve the major difference, namely that now the 2 kings are where they are and not where they were in the starting position. And that means that the black king and queen are on the same diagonal. And that's quite unfortunate for black, because now white is able to give a skewer, a check, followed by capturing the black queen for free when the black king moves out of the check. All of these ideas that I mentioned in this lesson are very typical for pawn endgames. Please always look out for them, because they may bring you a difference of a full point, winning a game instead of losing. Thank you so much for listening, and be back next week where I'll share some more chess knowledge with you. Bye-bye until then. Take care.